Johnstown, Colorado. Brain Cleavage is a place where thinking is always robust and intelligence is never artificial. Today I am really pleased because I took a little bit of time on the weekend, last weekend, to listen to some of our new lineups on KHNC, and I came across a show that I hadn't heard before. These guys are not totally new to KHNC. I just don't listen as much on the weekends, I guess, as I should. And that's going to be changing. So I invited these young gentlemen to join me in the studio today, not just because I want to, feel like a cougar, with two 20-something men with me. No, just kidding. We've got to have some humor here. But because I was so impressed with their message and the way that they could articulate their position, and because they are younger people and they're open, they're thinking, they're just doing their own thinking, and that's what Brain Cleavage is all about. I'm talking, of course, about the guys from Liberty Revolt, and their names are Cole and Bucky. So they're going to join me today, and we're going to have a rousing conversation and really exercise our brains. Welcome to Brain Cleavage, guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It's wonderful to have you here. So when I was listening to you guys on the weekend, what I got from my first opportunity to hear you was here's a couple of young men who maybe used to be Democrats or just felt they were more on the left.
That's true.
And then they started thinking about things and examining them a little bit more, and really kind of thought that party isn't really representative of what I think maybe no party is, which is cool too. I mean, because we need to break out of some of those old paradigms if we can in a positive way. But I'd like to just hear you guys tell a little bit about yourselves and your show. Your show is on Sundays at noon on KHNC for 1 hour, and it's called Liberty Revolt. So, Cole, we'll start with you, and Bucky. Just tell us a little bit about yourselves and your show.
Sure. Well, as you said, we're both former Democrats, and throughout my whole academic life in college, everything, I identified as a Democrat. But things weren't adding up, kind of, when I was in college. It seemed that I was being trained for sensitivity training as a teacher, training to be a teacher at CSU, and I just didn't think I needed to pay, $100,000 for someone to tell me that I'm privileged and, half racist and need to know how to teach other people in that way. So, when you look into the right, it's like you've never heard it because it's not in the popular narrative. So I kind of discovered this entire new world of knowledge and people that was sort of out of the purview.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
this is fairly recent.
Yeah, actually, well, it was probably before I moved to China. I was actually so disenfranchised with the American education system that I changed to a degree which privileges being in the forest. And then, as soon as I graduated, I left the country. So you can see how disillusioned I was by everything. So this was about 3 years ago.
That makes sense. Young people are usually somewhat idealistic and really, really searching for something that they feel has meaning. I mean, that makes sense to me.
Right, which is a good thing, which is something you want. But if you're revolutionary but misinformed, then it can actually be tremendously counterproductive. And that's kind of all about what Edmund Burke was talking about in his writings. So for my personal story, I was a lifelong Democrat, and I was actually surrounded by conservatives pretty much my entire life, but I had never actually absorbed any of that information. That just goes to show you how much dissonance there can be in your life when you're not actually diving into things yourself. You can hear conservative arguments all around you your entire life and never actually understand them. And so this is part of what happened to me. But growing up and going through school, I pretty much only heard one side of the story, and that was basically George Bush bad. And I mean, George Bush, let's be honest, he ruined Republicanism for an entire generation, for our generation at the very least. But it wasn't until leading up to the 2016 election, 2015, that I really started diving into politics. And at that time, it was mostly stuff that I found on Facebook. It wasn't any long-form philosophical ideas. It was all 3-minute Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Now This, kind of clips, and they have a way of really, they've got their formula. They know how to communicate with young people, and they're doing it extremely effectively, as you can see. But when Bernie Sanders lost the 2016 primary, I remember feeling incredibly cheated, and I remember being so angry with the Democrats that when Donald Trump won, he was with me that night. We actually celebrated, although neither of us were Trump supporters. And so it was this weird displacement from where we thought we were, but we hadn't really figured out where we stood ourselves. We were just kind of out here in this no man land, you know.
Political ether.
It sounds like the beginning of a political paradigm shift, is what it
Right,
was.
exactly.
Absolutely.
So you're like, okay, I don't know what I really believe, but I know that things aren't adding up. There's this cognitive dissonance about what happened in the Democratic Party, or that not Democratic. Let me make that statement. It's not a Democratic Party. They want you to think that they're for democracy and that that's all good, but it's just Democrat, and there's a difference between Democrat and Democratic. So let's be clear about our terms going forward, and we'll talk a little bit more about why all of this makes sense with what we're planning to talk about today when we come back from the break on Brain Cleavage with Kara. Stick with us. So, well, with that said, okay guys, here's what I want to talk about today. We are in the midst of what I would describe as our own cultural revolution
Right,
in the
we're
United
in
States.
an identity crisis as a country.
Well, you could call it a lot of things, and what it ends up being is going to depend a lot upon what happens, what our people do, how, if they come together, if they don't, if they allow themselves to be manipulated by others, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's really going to be interesting to get your perspective because, you know, I'm older than you guys are. I often sit and wonder, how could it be possible to reach people who are younger because they have a different mindset, a different experience? I don't really know how to relate to the people who are in the streets rioting. I kind of can at least hold accountable those who are in offices of authority over them and letting them riot and calling it peaceful protest. I can just call them out and say, hey, you scoundrels, you shouldn't even be in office. I think you guys are probably closet communists and you're part of this revolt. And I shouldn't use the word revolt, but revolution. So let's make some comparisons as a discussion item between revolutions of the past, specifically, primarily, of course, the Cultural Revolution of China and what's happening today. So we look at our history, even in the last 200 years. Okay, we have had the Third Reich, which was a fascist, not a revolution, but a fascist dictatorial system. The people didn't rise up from the bottom, but they were manipulated and controlled from the top. And the appeals were made to their sense of nationalism and all of their history and what was happening to them because of what happened in World War I and all of that. So there's similarities there. We had Mussolini, we had China's revolution, we had Vietnam, we had Cambodia, Pol Pot, and the number of people that were killed in these regimes, there's always people killed in them, always. So they're talking about revolution, which is supposed to be about freeing and liberating people, but yet whenever the revolution is over, there's a lot of people that die during the revolution, but then after the revolution, all the political enemies and opposition get killed. So during Hitler's reign, he is some people give him credit, if you want to call it credit, for killing up to 30 million people. The Red Scare, the Red Terror, killed 2 million, but during that Bolshevik Revolution, 12 million people died. Then Lenin killed up to 12 million. Then Stalin killed 60 million. South Korea, 2.5 million. Pol Pot, 2.5 million out of a population of only 8 million in that country. And leading up then to China, 80 million people. So now we've got people that are having a revolution in the streets of America, pulling down statues and lighting a torch to buildings. What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, if you look at the parallels to something like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, they didn't even need secret police in, cultural revolutionary China, because the people were so thoroughly indoctrinated with the ideology of the left that Mao only had to say, get out there and take down the bourgeoisie. And it turned into something that was absolutely devastating, not only for Chinese culture then, but for Chinese culture now. And, they've never fully recovered. And you see kind of the beginnings of something similar here in this country. And it's, when you look at these revolutions of the past, it really becomes staggering at how much human suffering they created. And I don't think people understand that.
That's an excellent point, Cole. So these revolutions, there has to be a certain amount of unrest and dissatisfaction and disgruntlement to begin with. And some of that, I think, is legitimate and should be addressed in legitimate ways, but it's instead exploited. But the other thing is that people who want to control the masses simply find ways to foment unrest and then exploit it. And I'm concerned that the young people of the United States who have had a terrible education overall, remember, here's an example from the Bolshevik Revolution. They took over, that country, Russia, and they perfected the model of communist dictatorship. And then a guy who was in the KGB there, several of them, of course, but one named Yuri Brezhnev,
right, defected and came to the
defected
United
here,
States
and then he
to kind
told
of
us.
explain the tactic, right?
Yes,
about
he
how
told us the tactics.
They were intending to subvert the ideology of the youth to socialism over the course of several generations, and that they found it would be much easier to convince young people to tear down their own country here than it would be for them to take us on militarily. And you are seeing this, and there has been trained Marxist organizers behind a lot of these cultural movements, behind a lot of the riots that are actually organizing demonstrations, and then you have professional agitators, and then you have a lot of young people who are swept in it, mostly from, it comes from two places, I think. It comes from, number one, we've done a terrible job of teaching our young people gratitude, of teaching young people that, there is something about our traditions. There is I call it a silent wisdom, right, that has been passed down through our traditions, both culturally and politically, that have made it so that we've been able to generate this tremendous society that has brought so much wealth and so much freedom to the world. And I think one of the things that's happened in our schools is they always feel like they're doing a better job when they're teaching the counter argument. And then they've been systematically one-upping themselves, and pretty soon it's gotten to the point to where they no longer teach our traditional cultural values. They no longer teach what was so unique about the American founding. That was, the American Revolution was so much different than, say, the French Revolution, because we had a plan for what to do afterwards. So many of these revolutions, people get real amped up to tear down the system before they've really articulated how they're going to put it back together. And that's something we need to be very careful about. So I think it comes from a lack of gratitude. It comes from this critical social justice theory where they've been taught to find injustices everywhere. And that really plays into the hands of it plays into the hands of all politicians, but particularly politicians on the left, because a big part of their party platform is solving injustices. And what happens is they always have to take it one step further. Once they solve an injustice, what's great about conservatism is that there's a foundation to it, and there's an end goal. They point to a single document and they say, this is it. This is the legitimate role of government. The government is in place to protect your natural freedoms, and if we have to tax you and limit your freedoms just enough to protect those, then we'll do that. But it's very much different on the left, because it's, the well-intentioned liberalism stems forth from it vicious progressivism, and that is progress at all costs. And they think that you need to tax the people the maximum amount possible so that they can implement these good things. Well, what are these good things? These are good things according to the progressives. Whatever is in vogue at that moment, and it tends to be things that are unsustainable, like $93 trillion Green New Deals.
Mm-hmm. And I like the way you used unsustainable in a really honest way instead of a cliche way there. Good job. So Yuri talked about the first step of destabilizing a country or subverting it was through demoralization, taking over the education system, changing the way people think. That has been successful. He said it was completed even in the 1980s, began in the 1960s. The next stage was destabilization. He said it takes 2 to 5 years. That's when people really start to infiltrate the government and they start to take over the defense establishment, the economy, and that sort of thing. And then there's the crisis point. That can take 6 weeks, can take less. I think we're in a crisis right now. And then after that, normalization. And this is really a dangerous time in our history because what happens as a result of COVID and everything that's happened with COVID, and what happens as a result of all of the rioting on the basis of these social justice warrior topics like Black Lives Matter and Antifa and all that, what happens as a result of that is going to determine the future of our nation. And so what I'd like to ask Cole simply, because he hasn't spoken since before you did, Becky, is what do you think that the guys that are rioting in the streets, obviously they don't have a foundation. Their education system didn't teach them the foundations of our system of democracy. What do you think they hope that, do they even think about, if they destroy what's here, what are they going to get instead?
See, I really don't think they think about it, and I've seen this because these things like, for one, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, many of these organizations that, kind of proctor protests end up not having leaders, right? They're leaderless revolutions, and if you don't have a leader, you don't have a goal, you don't have a list of demands that you're saying, we're fighting for this. When you look at the Hong Kong protesters before China basically took Hong Kong, what they said was, we want this, we want this, we want this, and we're going to organize peacefully every day until we get it. That is how you have a revolution of policy. A revolution of policy is not a revolution of ideology, which puts something in the place of a structured system that allows for change. We have that, but we don't know what we want the change to be. See, if these people had leaders, if they organized on the basis of policy, things would be far different. But it's like they're just letting themselves be controlled by a leftist narrative, and that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at this. These kids and young people and others are one of their messages has consistently been, let's take away the power of the 1%. The 1% has too much. They're too powerful. They're too rich. We need more. The problem is that it's the 1%. As I can see it, I don't know if I'm sure you guys can. It's the 1% that are feeding them that message and spurring them on in their activities, and they don't realize that the very people that they think they're against are the people who are in control of them and will wrest complete control from the country if what we have is destroyed.
Right. So I mean, the big money interests that they're actually talking about, these bankers and these international corporations, the real 1% isn't bound by United States borders. So what's going to happen when this revolution comes to fruition is they're going to leave, and anyone who's technically in the middle class are going to be the ones who get destroyed by this revolution, and that's going to allow the real 1%ers to accumulate much more power.
Right. Because one thing that we have in our system, the United States system, is opportunity, and we do have equality. We declare and guarantee equality of opportunity for all, so that people can work hard and use their gifts, their natural talents, and have no hopefully, the idea is to remove barriers to succeeding. And if what these guys are doing in this revolution is successful, then they will trade that for this sort of like in a vacuum concept of equality that makes everybody the same and gives nobody the opportunity to succeed.
Right, they don't differentiate between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And we can see the differences in this drawn starkly by different populations in the U.S. and especially by Asian Americans, who typify the richest population in the U.S., even beyond white Americans. So when you're talking about privilege, no one's going to go out of their way to say, oh, Asian privilege. And that's the difference between equality of opportunity and outcome.
And there is, to me, in my opinion, there is no, it means it's meaningless to say opportunity as an identity. I mean, equality as an identity. You can't make there be equality. Everybody cannot be equal by force. So we'll talk a little bit more about this and more when we come back to Brain Cleavage with Kara, and I have my guests today from Liberty Revolt, Cole and Bucky. Right now, we're talking about the cultural revolution in the United States that is, I don't know, I think it's going on. It's certainly something that is being pushed. There are powers that shouldn't be that are trying to make that happen. And I think we need to put it down. We need to say, hey, like these, I'm sorry guys, I don't mean to be disrespectful to you, but you guys are kids to me. You're so much younger than I am, and like all these people in the streets are kids to me. And I just want to say, we got to, give these kids a spanking and send them home because they're misbehaving. And I think that that's part of this cultural problem that we talked about earlier as well. We talked about the lack of the effectiveness of our education system, how it was infiltrated and taken over. It's not really about education. It's about indoctrination. It's about making people kind of, mind controlled and susceptible to the lies that they're now being told. But there's also this other things in our culture, like this permissiveness. I don't know your guys' beliefs on this at all, and I'm very respectful of other people's beliefs, but I personally believe that when we, as a nation, had a Supreme Court that said it's okay to kill babies in the womb, and isn't it interesting when you're watching TV and you see commercials or TV shows, they talk about, the woman was carrying a baby and the baby was threatened, and they make a big deal out of the baby and the baby's life, as long as the woman wants the baby. But if a baby's not wanted, then, it's okay just to get rid of it. That is not acceptable. So we have a culture now where I believe we introduced a culture of death in 1973 officially in the United States. I think that has affected the young people who have been raised ever since then, and I think that there's been other things that are dysfunctional that have happened, such as parents have limited the sizes of their families more, so a lot of them have only one child. That one child is terribly spoiled. There's no discipline, there's no accountability, that parents don't teach that kid how to be respectful. You see that when you go into a restaurant or a place to buy something, and this younger person doesn't even think that they owe you the time to get off their phone, even though they're there working, getting paid for it, to stop and greet you and be polite, or to say thank you after you buy something. There's something that died in our culture in 1973, and I think it was as a result of Roe versus Wade, and I think that it affects our culture today. Now we see these kids who really don't believe anything, they don't believe in anything, and they are kind of soulless. Now, I wasn't planning to put that all out here today, and I don't know what you guys think of it, but it's just my own belief.
Well, I think the soullessness kind of results also as a dethroning of meaning, and this is mostly in academia. When you look at, I've talked about it a lot, postmodern philosophy, what they do is they basically shift the foundations of meaning to say that everything is relative to the point where everything only makes sense in the context of something else. So there's no universal truth to these people. And, these are the same people who say we should be cultural relativists, but that we also have a rape culture in the U.S. So, I'll let the audience square away what that could possibly mean, but the fundamental contradictions of the philosophy fly over the heads of undergrads.
There you go.
I think, they put this in the founding documents, and they actually warned what would happen. They said that liberty is meant for a moral and God
and religious
people. Yes. And so, that's why we put "In God We Trust" on our coins, right? The whole point is that we have to have a moral foundation that is widely accepted and agreed upon, because if we don't place our moral foundation in something concrete, then morality is just an opinion, right? And that's where we get this postmodernism is it's all contextual, it's all relative, it's all just an opinion.
So who decides then what the values are? Okay, so let's do a comparison and contrast. We have established values in our system of government that's established in the United States. By the way, nationality and sovereignty, national sovereignty, are being attacked by the 1%, by the globalists, right? So this isn't a surprise. But our values, some of them are property rights. When you own a property, that property is an extension of your person. And we, as a nation, have always believed that we respect people, their intrinsic value, they have They are a created being in the image of God, and then when they own property, their property is an extension of their personhood. That's why we allow people to defend their property. Now that's being challenged in a new way today, and we have to stand up for what our values really are. Another thing that we value is, this equality of opportunity that we talked about earlier. You have the opportunity to excel to the greatest level possible. That it's all up to you, really. The rule of law, it applies equally to every person. It doesn't apply only to some people but not others. We don't give some people immunity from the law, not in theory. Now, is it always practiced in perfection? No. But why are we giving up the idealism of our system because of the fact that it's not always practiced perfectly? And then we value freedom and liberty, and we have due process. You can't just be thrown in jail unless there's evidence to substantiate that an indictment against you has some kind of standing in court. You have habeas corpus. I mean, all these things, they protect everybody. Now, with that said, what are the values of the left and of the Antifa kids and of the Black Lives Matter people? What are this postmodernism, these social justice values, what are they? How do you define them?
I don't think they even know.
Yeah, I think the whole system of values is kind of upended by this philosophy and is trying to be replaced by something which is a staunch egalitarianism that can only be enforced by force. And, once again, we've seen kind of the myth busting around this equality of opportunity and outcome. So, it's the fact that they don't have a leader, they don't have a plan, they don't have anything, and they're doing this so violently that really disenfranchises the whole movement. I mean, if you can come forth with a document that says, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it, and this is what we want to do, and you can present that peacefully, then, I think when that was happening in the beginning, you get a large portion of the population behind it. But so much of this has been twisted with revolutionary ends and political means, and, the founder of Black Lives Matter, the organization, coming out and saying, we're trained Marxists. So if that doesn't tell you about some of their values, I don't know what will, because socialist values are trying to manifest themselves through the youth at this moment. So I think the values associated with socialism and communism, which are always shifty,
And authoritarianism can come from both sides. It can come from any point on the political spectrum. I don't like to think of it as a straight line with fascism on one side and authoritarian communism on the other side. I prefer to think of it more as a circle with authoritarianism on top and libertarianism on bottom, and then a right and a left wing. And I mean, they really do turn into the same thing at their extreme points, and the extremes really do feed off each other as well. When you have communist revolutionaries in the streets, fascists show up, right? It prospers. Somebody wants to do something about it, and I think part of the reason I went from the left to more of an independent conservatarian, I call it, is because when I look at which party is leaning a lot more drastically towards that authoritarian side, I think it's the left. And I think this becomes evident when you look at some of the common traits of authoritarian, whether on the right or the left, whatever you want to call it, is they want to trample private property. They want to trample freedom of speech. They want to take away guns. They want to raise taxes. They want to give power to certain groups by taking it away from certain other groups. And I think you're seeing this much more on the left. The attacks on free speech, the attacks on the Second Amendment, all of these things. And I think what is going on with this revolution is going to be interesting. We might be okay for a generation,
or we might be down the toilet. It could be a coin toss. We'll be back with Brain Cleavage in just a moment. Thank you for coming back to join us some more. We're having a great conversation today on Brain Cleavage with my friends from Liberty Revolt, Cole and Bucky. And we've been talking very high philosophically about the cultural revolution happening in the United States, and really kind of just positing assumptions and hypotheses about what might happen moving forward. But one thing we agreed on is that we are definitely in a state of crisis in this country. One thing that gives me hope is that people like Cole and Bucky, young people who are very much thinking individuals, And they're seeing the fallacies of what is happening with a lot of our younger generation. People who are willing to throw away the guarantees of their liberty that are embedded in this nation for something that they know not what it is. And that reminds me of an example of some experience I had. A long time ago when I did more Facebooking, I had a friend, his name was David, and after the 2016 election, he came to me and he said, you have to renounce your support of President Trump, or I will not be your friend. I will not be friends with anybody who supports President Trump. And he was very hateful about it. And I really liked this guy. We had great, meaningful conversation. I thought he was a good thinker. And he just put it out to me that way. He thought that President Trump, like so many people do, he thought he was hateful, blah, blah, blah. That this kind of highlights the harshness, the spirit of harshness and subjectivity that is behind the values of the younger generation, the ones that are revolting in the streets. And it also is the same spirit that's behind all these revolutions of history that we've been talking about, because it's that spirit of, well, there's some kind of amorphous, subjective idea of what's right and what's wrong and who's right and who's wrong. It's really based on authoritarianism and who you're following. And if you don't fit in with that, then it's okay for violence to be, exacted upon you. And to me, cutting off a friendship is kind of, in a sense, it felt sort of like a violent act to me at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what people don't get is liberals will never see why so much of middle America is red. And the reason that they voted for Trump is that, Trump ran as a populist, not some pompous, elitist, you people are clinging to guns and religion sort of highbrow figure. You see tweets with people saying that go viral and get millions of views that say, oh, if you support President Trump, you're a racist, period. And I say, well, Biden wrote the tough on crime bill that disproportionately targets minorities. What about that? If you vote for him, you ain't black. What about that? What about the law that him and Obama signed into law that you can indefinitely detain American citizens? So if you vote for Biden, you're an authoritarian automatically by the same logic they use to classify you as a racist for following President Trump. And I think it's the exact same level of intolerance that is purported as, one of the anti-virtues of the left, because they claim to be very tolerant, but they will disown your friendship for your support of a political figure.
Do you think that, this is kind of a quick U-turn, but it's still on the same road, that people who are millennials tend to be, at the same time, rebellious and distrustful of the rich and all the things that they've been conditioned to be against, but at the same time very trusting of authority? And I'm seeing some of this. I have this theory because of what I'm seeing with the COVID thing.
Yeah, so I think we've had a rise in single motherhood, which is honestly the biggest issue facing the United States. I think if we could sort that out, we'd sort out a lot of our other issues. But kind of what happens in these situations is we've entrusted a lot of the enculturement of our children and to the state. We've really given the school system and given the state a lot of leeway to parent our children, and they've been coddled for almost their entire lives, more so than any other generation in history, where if they ever have a problem, they just scream at whoever the administrative entity is over them to get what they want. And I think that's actually a sign of hope, is because the same people that are saying they're socialists, the same young people that claim to be socialists, when polled, also don't trust government. They don't, they understand that the best friend of big government and big business are each other, right? They go hand in hand. And I don't think they have a really good definition of what socialism is, and I don't think they've been taught about socialist revolutions.
I think if we could just awaken within them their thinking capacity and their souls, we would have a real force, a real army. But I just had this revelation as you were talking. I see this as a kind of a paradox. On one hand, you've got these kids, like this age group, living in this post-Roe v. Wade world, and there has been a lot of divorce, a lot of single mothers, And so they are coddled. They're not disciplined heavily in a lot of cases. They're not really taught a lot of values like hard work and work ethic, because in a lot of cases, we as the parents have felt guilty for our divorces or for whatever. So the kids are kind of wimpy in a way. But then on the flip side of it, so they do question some things, but on the flip side, like you said, they'll whine or they'll misbehave, but then they'll run back to mommy because that's where their security is. And I see these kids in the streets sort of similarly. They're revolting because they know something's missing. Something's missing in their own souls. But they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what they're missing. They didn't get the education that I did, and so they're revolting because they know something's missing, and they really don't believe that they're gonna, not be able to run back to mommy at the end of the day and be okay. You and I, even though we're a different generation, we recognize that if it goes too far, they won't be able to run back to mommy, and things won't be okay anymore.
Right. We've really failed to inculcate in our children a value for personal responsibility. And you hear the right talk about personal responsibility a lot, but they don't really tell you why it's so important. We've done a really poor job about explaining why it's important. It's probably the most important thing, because everything else stems from that. You can't be empowered if you're not personally responsible. You can't live in a free society if you're not personally responsible. You can't compete in a free market if you don't have mental toughness and fortitude.
I have to stop you. You said you can't live in a free society if you're not responsible. Think about that. What these people who are revolting in the streets are doing is asking for a non-free society.
If you've been following the news cycle like me, you're probably a little more anxious and not sleeping quite as well as you could be. I get you. That's why I use the products from our trusted friends at 420 Friendlies. 420 Friendlies offers great deals on 100% locally made glass clothing and smoking accessories. I have been loving the mental and physical health benefits of their extensive line of CBD products, including sodas, candies, lotions, salves, capsules, and more. My personal favorites are the sodas. I love CBD lemonades and colas, and I can tell you from first-hand experience, nothing works better to relieve pain and facilitate a healing sunburn than a batch of 420 Friendly's CBD salve. If you have headaches, insomnia, joint pain, anxiety, CBD products from 420 Friendlies are truly incredible, and so are the staff. I've been shopping and doing business with them for years. I trust them and enjoy them. They're experienced and knowledgeable, and that's why I shop exclusively at 420 Friendlies for all my smoking, vaping, and organic alternative needs. Again, they are located at 6628 West 10th Street in Greeley, just east of the King Supers. Find them online at 420 Friendlies in Greeley or call them at 970-451-5004. That's 970-451-5004. You can trust my friends at 420 Friendlies in Greeley, Northern Colorado's premier head shop. Tell them that Bucky Dillon sent you.
what's going on in terms of this revolution that we're seeing happening in the United States and our values. How do we stop this revolution, or how do we get the most out of the good parts of it, where people are questioning things and having paradigm shifts and wanting to be more responsible citizens to really live in a free country, versus holding back the ultimate horribleness that could happen, which obviously happened in China and has ruined their freedom. And we kind of made a U-turn at some point in the last segment, and we've been talking about millennials and what are their values, what do they believe, what do they think they will accomplish by burning down buildings and pulling down statues. And now we're talking about how do they, they seem to be very compliant about the COVID rules, yet they're acting anti-authoritarian in the streets, and they seem really afraid, and they don't question things, and it's just kind of unique. It's a unique paradigm that we're looking at, or a paradox, perhaps. And I'm seeing, a lot of fear in a lot of people, but the millennials, I mean, they are definitely acting like they believe that whatever we're told to do about COVID is something we should do, and that they can completely and totally trust what we're being told. So I guess they're good little soldiers out there in this cultural revolution, unless we can wake them up. What do you guys think?
Well, it was Edward Snowden kind of came on to a couple different news networks and did a live stream with some reporters and said, guys, we need to be very wary and vigilant of the government milking a crisis like they always do to, put in place legislation such as the Patriot Act and expanding the powers of the surveillance state and all these things. And I think these concerns are equally as valid. And, you need to privilege both sides of the coin and understand that we have to be vigilant while doing our part to be responsible and keep each other safe. I mean, keeping each other safe and being responsible partly is making sure that these things don't go into effect and that these people aren't using this crisis to milk the population for a new Patriot Act.
And I really think they have this mindset that has preceded a lot of cultural revolutions that have ended in tyranny, where they think that they can trust the government when their people are in charge. And they don't think past that. They don't realize that, sure, it might go well when you have your, benevolent leader in charge, but eventually somebody bad is going to end up behind the levers of power that you expanded. You expanded the government's ability to implement power in our lives, and this is what they don't realize is that in order this is why personal responsibility is so important. In order for the government to solve injustices, in order for the government to solve problems, the government needs to accumulate the power to do so, which means limiting your freedoms and taking your resources so that the government can reallocate them to solving these injustices. And so one of the traps you fall into is the harder we focus on utilizing the powers of government to solve these injustices instead of personal responsibility, it's going to lend itself to an authoritarian regime.
Yes, and that's perfect statement of why we need to have rule of law, why we need to have foundational principles and operational principles governing our nation that apply equally to all in an objective way instead of subjective things that, as you said, can be abused if you don't happen to trust the leader that's in power. So there's a lot of education to be done. I know you guys are doing your share of it. I applaud you for what you're doing with Liberty Revolt. You guys have a community chat that's coming up on Friday night at 7:30. You can find it on The Liberty Revolt on Facebook if you want to follow it live. And if you want to look at past ones that are archived, you can go to the website
www.libertyrevoltmedia.com.
LibertyRevoltMedia.com. I want to thank my guests Cole and Bucky for being here on Brain Cleavage
Thank
today.
you so much for having us, Kara. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to 1360 AM, KHNC,
The
Freedom Radio.
The Roar of the Rockies.